And welcome back. Lambda Legal is the oldest and largest national legal organization whose mission is to achieve full recognition of the civil rights of LGBTQ plus people and everyone living through with HIV through impact litigation, education, as well as public policy work. Now, the organization recently launched the Protected and Served Community Survey, exploring government misconduct and harm by police, prisons, school security, and courts against LGBTQ people and people living with HIV in the United States. And here now to tell us more is the Senior Attorney of Criminal Justice and Police Misconduct Strategist at Lambda Legal. He's also the author of Protected and Served, Richard Saenz. And Richard, good to have you.
Thank you so much, Daren, for having me.
And when we talk about this advocacy and litigation, obviously your hands are full, but give us your insight as to where we are right now, particularly when it comes to the rights of the LGBTQ community. Are we seeing more and more tolerance in that area?
I think there's been an increase in just understanding what the needs are of LGBTQ people and people living with HIV, be it through social change as well as affirming legal rights and protections. You know, where we've had major legal victories, but at the same time, we're also going through probably one of the most hostile and dangerous legislative sessions of the past year across the country, where over 500 anti-LGBTQ bills were introduced. A number of those became laws dealing with things like prohibiting or banning access to medical care for young transgender and gender non-conforming and non-binary people. We've seen an increase of violence against LGBTQ people, including some of our community spaces like clubs. But at the same time that there have been a number of victories and just the idea that our community should be safe, that we will do what we can to keep each other safe. We've seen really a backlash, and Lambda Legal, we've always been at the forefront of fighting in the courts and legislatively, but we also need to recognize the importance of grassroots organizing, the importance of people really coming together and supporting each other, because that is just as important as legal victories. It's the idea that we should treat each other with respect and dignity, and also to keep each other safe.
I know what you wanted to do is really get a lay of the land and see how things are. And so you came up and you have the Protected and Served Community Survey, and it has some particular findings, but let's go through it for a second. Why did you decide that you wanted to go ahead with the survey?
We need information. We know if we're out there advocating that, yes, we can share the stories of our community members and things that they have gone through. Every time we file a new case, we're telling the story about our clients. But it's also important that we have this data to support what we are trying to get policymakers and other advocates to understand, that from a community survey like Protected and Served, we're able to show that our survey reached over 2,500 people. Of those, a number of them reported that they had experienced government misconduct, be it by police or other law enforcement, or their experiences in the courts, or also in folks who have been in custody in prisons and jails. So these numbers, behind each number is a real person. And I think it's important that we are telling those stories as well as the stories that we're telling in court. When we decided to do Protected and Served, this was really a sequel to the survey that we conducted back in 2010, where the main question that we were, in 2012, the main question we were trying to show was, is there discrimination and bias and government misconduct within the criminal legal system? And that 2012 survey, found, yes, there is. With this survey, what we wanted to do was really explore what were those experiences like, and what are some recommendations that policymakers, community members, and people who work within the criminal legal system can take up and really try to not only lead to changes, but also to hold accountable those people within the criminal legal system who are causing these harms, and to hold them accountable and to enforce these policies that might look good on paper, But if you're not enforcing them, then they're really not worth that much.
When I saw some of the statistics, I know that one of the things is that 3 in 10 really don't have a trust for police. I don't think that number is too startling, but yet and still it is concerning.
It's very concerning, and I wish that these are not, they're concerning, but they're not new. I've been, since the release of the report, I've been meeting with community members, with other attorneys at different conferences across the country, and when I share these findings about the levels of trust, people aren't surprised. But I think a reflection of the need to um, think about these changes that we're pushing for in order to make sure that our community members' rights are protected, that people are not experiencing violence by government actors such as police officers and other law enforcement, and to hold them accountable. One of the major things that happened as we were thinking about doing this protected and served community survey was the killing of George Floyd, the summer of 2020, as we were living through a global pandemic. We were also living through a parallel pandemic of police violence and racial violence. We saw community members working to take care of each other, but we also saw an increase in surveillance, increase in policing, and that really had a huge impact on top of everything else, of how people viewed their levels of trust with police, and also this idea that the legal system is fair, or that if you go to court that you will have your fair day in court. And I think those are important things that policymakers, judges, and people who are making decisions about policing need to really take into consideration, and things need to change.
Give me your insight on this here, because when we talk about having these numbers, 3 in 10 really don't really trust. You got to talk about reporting and being able to come forward. And we know that within this community, whether it's a crime, whether it's reports of alleged abuse, things of that nature, those are sometimes hard to get across the table. When you're standing in front of a police officer to make that report, you say, I don't want to make that report. I feel this distrust. But what does that do? I mean, to a certain extent, it also undermines your work, because those statistics are very key and critical if you're trying to really make your voice heard.
Thank you for raising that, Daren. I think one of the arguments we have made in courts is, if the community has a lack of trust or low levels of trust in these systems, and we asked that question about trust for the various government institutions, and I believe except for schools, over half of the participants had low level or no trust. So it's actually a bit higher if you look at it, for all of the government institutions, not just, except for schools, where I believe it was close to that 50%. So it wasn't doing great in terms of our community's trust in the school systems either. But it does undermine what we think about when, what if I do have to report a crime? Do I go to the police? Do I feel safe going to the police in order to do this? And I think what we also saw was that people were not reporting some of the certain types of crimes to police, such as sexual abuse or violence, or intimate partner violence. And that's it's shocking to think about, if the way that we can get some relief is to go to the police, but people are concerned about their own safety and even reporting it to the police, or is it a police officer or a law enforcement officer who's the one actually perpetrating this crime? That these are things that we have to consider. The other piece is, if I have to go through the criminal legal system or through the court system, am I going to be safe, or am I going to face discrimination at every step of the way, beginning with filling out the police report, where we heard from some of our community members that when they interacted with police, even if they were reporting a crime, that they experienced some form of government misconduct, including misgendering of trans or non-binary people, of sexual violence or sexual harassment when they were reporting these things. So these are issues that we have known about for years, and there have been cases and there have been policy changes. But I believe we're now at the point of how do we hold these departments and these police officers accountable, and how do we enforce these policies? So I actually think of it that we're now past this idea of criminal justice reform, and we're at the stage of how do we hold these departments and government officials and people who work for these systems accountable.
You talk a little bit in the report about racial disparities. And when you talk about racial disparities, particularly when it comes to people of color, when it comes to proof of immigration status, and there seems to be more in the area of communities of color that are being asked about immigration status. Give me some more insight into that, please.
Sure, and that was one of the questions we did ask people in the survey. And so for people who had face-to-face contact with police, 26% of the Latino or Latinx participants said that police asked for proof of their immigration status. This same thing happened to over half, around 56% of Black participants. And what we found were that people of color were more likely than white participants to be asked for proof of their immigration status. Why is this important? Again, if we're thinking about different barriers that people face in reporting, or even seeing that police officers or police departments are places that they can go to seek help, this is already something that's weighing on your mind of like, am I going to be asked about my immigration status where it's not relevant to the issue that I'm experiencing? But I know that can be that can have such a chilling effect on so many members of our community who have these concerns, or don't want to bother with being asked about things that are not relevant. And that's just an additional barrier. Thinking about people in New York City, if I live in the Bronx and I have experienced a crime, am I going to go to the police, or am I going to feel safe going to the police if I'm also concerned that they're going to be asking about my immigration status or for things not relevant to what I just went through?
We know that there has been significant changes that have been made in policy and also in policing in the NYPD across the city. But we know that some of those changes took place 2012, and that was a huge timestamp in terms of policies and procedures. Where are we right now, and what have you found that since 2012? Are some things still the same, and have we gotten significant change, especially when we talk about advocacy and bias and those hot button words that we talk about?
Right, and I think it is fair that we talking about it as these hot button words, and for a moment there's a lot of interest and resources are given, and then there seems to be a lag off. And I think looking at 2012 to the this recent survey, the answer is there has been change, but more needs to be done. And it's a difference of until those numbers are zero in terms of people's experiences of negative conduct or misconduct, then there's still so much more work to do. And celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall uprising, the police chief at the time, did give a public apology. The Stonewall, uprising was about police violence. And I said in response to that, thanks for the apology, but we need to see it on the ground. What are the changes that are going to happen? And I still think that's what we're living with. As we're seeing, again, thinking about the summer of 2020, the violence that our community members, and I'm thinking our full community, not just if you're looking at someone based on their race or their sexual orientation or gender identity, because for many people, we can't and we don't separate those multiple identities that we have. But if the police officer is doing something that is violating my rights, as what was happening during the protests and organizing that happened during December of 2020 against police violence, then it still raises the question of like, what are we going to do to really hold these departments accountable for the misconduct that they continue to do? How many more studies do we have to do, or surveys do we have to do to show that this is a problem? how many more times must NYPD get sued? How many more people have to die in Rikers before we say this is a priority and we must um, bring about change?
Yeah, we got critics on the other side who say, listen, here's another survey. You guys throw out another survey. We got these numbers. They're telling, it sounds like the same thing over and over again. But from your perspective, as one who sees the numbers, reads the numbers, and then also reads in between the lines, where do you go from here?
We keep pushing for change. We keep suing. We keep using all of the resources we have to create this change where we're protecting people's rights. We're protecting their basic dignity. I wanted that all New Yorkers, can be out in our community and be safe without having to think about, if I get stopped by a police officer, am I going to be harassed? Am I going to face physical violence or sexual violence? If I'm in the court, am I going to have my fair day in court? And I think it's not too optimistic to think of it that way. But if we're really going to live within this system and our criminal legal system, then we as attorneys, as community members, we have to keep pushing to holding them accountable and enforcing our rights and our own protections, and keep at it, because these little changes that we make in the long run are going to have a huge impact on what do we think justice is, what do we think it means to have impartial courts, and for us to have our rights protected.
I've highlighted a couple of things in terms of the discrepancies that the police department have had in terms of like 3 and 10. People don't feel comfortable in going out and having a conversation with police or actually reporting. And we know what the follow-up to that is, that sometimes people will just have hesitancy and not report. My question to you is, given the fact we've got these numbers, you hear what the people are saying, what's been the response of law enforcement when they've seen the survey, and have they given you any insight?
I have not received any insight from law enforcement. I'm open to having that conversation. Lambda Legal, we have represented law enforcement in protecting their rights in discrimination cases. But I think at this point, it's more, how do we get community members to be engaged with these various processes of calling for change? I want policymakers to look at these numbers when they're thinking about new legislation to protect the rights of LGBTQ people and people living with HIV, that they're not forgetting that a number of us do have interaction with the criminal legal system, including prisons and jails, the courts and policing. And so that you have to think of our experiences when you're pushing for these new laws. I think to the point of what have law enforcement said about these numbers, again, I haven't heard directly from people, but I hope when they look at these numbers that they see that behind each one is a real person and that this was their experience.
What do we do in terms of countering the real issue that we have in terms of having people be able to come forward, to talk, to be able to share, because that's how effective change. You're talking about awareness, you're talking about getting out in the community and also letting people know. But we know that when we're in communities of color, the two biggest things that are barriers when it comes to these matters that we're talking about: immigration and the feel for potential retaliation. How do you get that word out to the community? Listen, don't you worry about immigration. Don't fear potential retaliation. But we need you to really be a part of this ongoing conversation to try to break down some of these walls.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I would say that these fears of harassment, of violence are real,
Right.
and these are valid concerns. So I would suggest that one of the recommendations we make is looking at alternatives to engaging with the criminal legal system. We had people report that for certain types of crimes that they did go to community organizations that were not affiliated or attached to law enforcement. Going to organizations such as the New York City Anti-Violence Project, and reporting incidents of hate violence or intimate partner violence. I would push for looking at different ways that we can make sure that those community groups have the resources that they need so that
I got you, Richard. Keep going.
we continue to look at ways of making sure that people are safe when they are reporting, that when they are within the criminal legal system, that they have the support and resources that they need. And really, I think the larger effect is that you're creating something that community members um, have a real buy-in for, and it's providing resources that go to these organizations that are doing really great things, not only just so that people can report, but that they're providing services and support for people who need it.
We talk about the people who need it. Obviously, there's a lot out there that need the services. For somebody that's out there right now and wants to connect, and maybe they feel as though, listen, I've been violated, or they feel like I've got a story to tell, my experience. How do they go about getting that experience to you or to the necessary people so that way they can go forward with the action that they potentially may want to take?
I would encourage everyone to check out the report, and we have some additional materials. It's all at protectedandserved.org. You can also, if you are someone who is living with HIV or LGBTQ, and you are experiencing discrimination or bias, we do have a legal help desk that people can reach out to, where we provide information and resources to people. Just thinking about some of the community partners that I have worked with in the past, I want people to know that the Legal Aid Society provides both civil and criminal resources if you're dealing with a civil legal issue or a criminal legal issue. Legal Services NYC, the New York City Anti-Violence Project. These are all great resources. And I also want to highlight that the Transgender Law Center, they put out a resource of how do you report police misconduct. Again, that's the Transgender Law Center, and they have a resource on reporting police misconduct.
I know we had the transgender community on recently, and they shared sometimes we don't, and when they say we, meaning the heterosexual and the population of people who aren't transgender, really don't understand the amount of discrimination that goes on in their lives, and sometimes how we, through silence, actually enhance the discrimination and the violation that they experience. Can you corroborate that?
I think that's true, and I think it's always important that we are centering people who are the ones who are experiencing it. So again, thinking about the use of resources, and another recommendation from the report is that we provide resources to transgender-led organizations so that people who are experiencing this harm, we're not just centering them, but we're also giving them the resources that they need in order to address some of these harms that they're experiencing.
So, Richard, before we go, how do people connect, and how do they get connected to the work?
Again, please check out the report at protectedandserved.org, and you can follow Lambda Legal on all social media platforms at Lambda Legal.
Definitely great talk about the intersectionality as well as some of the disparities that go on in our community, and it's important that we highlight what's happening and also the potential for change. And so thank you for being with us, Richard. Great information, and of course we'll continue to follow. Thanks for being with us, brother.
Thank you.
All righty, taking a quick break. We will be back with more on the Social Justice Forum right after this.